Hello to you all. Fantastic to see so many of you here. My name is Graham Halling. I'm the Director of Consulting at Carta Advisory. And in the next hour or so, myself and Ben Pittman are looking forward to exploring with you some of the universal fears and wariness that surround digital transformation and all the disruptive stories that tend to surround that particular subject. I hope to provide you some inspiration as well, actually, because there needs to be some hope based around the experiences that we've found with clients, and I think some of the stories that Ben will tell you will expand on that. We'll talk about leveraging Agile in all things. We'll talk about the environments and cultures that really lead to customer-centric businesses. And I think talking about totally aligning mission, and we'll talk a lot about how we do that with clients. But I think before we do that, let's elaborate on the title of the talk. Now, who got a chill when they heard that rhyme a little while ago? Those of a certain age will certainly remember it. I mean, I don't know if you remember how genuinely scary that film was, but I know as a 14-year-old boy trying to impress 16-year-old girls at the cinema, it was a genuinely scary movie. And I think that's really what I want to talk about today. I kind of want to talk about the kind of crack between fingers fear that surrounds this topic, and to some extent, the idea that things will happen in your dreams that will haunt you in the real world, which is, of course, what the topic of that film was. And that's the kind of paralysing fear that we're going to talk about here today. Transformation, disruption, big, scary words. And the subjective meanings of those words have been lost over the years, and they've come to mean all sorts of things to different people, depending on where you're coming at them from. But I think the main thing is that the endowment of those words with the kind of ethereal spectre of fear that Freddy Krueger represents is really what I want to address today. And I want to kind of make sure that we talk about not fearing those things, but embracing the opportunities they present. So the thing that stayed with me about that film, perhaps more than anything else, is the fact that all the kids were having the same dream. And I think the idea that we're all having that same dream, and that what should be your blue sky time, the dreams that you have when you're asleep, ought to be the things about talking about flying and gaining wings and doing extraordinary things. But actually, if there's a spectre that's haunting those dreams, it can start to debilitate your thinking, your strategic intent, and actually your operational execution. So I think if you can stay with me with some of these metaphors, there is a clear, or there are clear analogies, there are clear connections around kind of the scary prospect of digital transformation and disruption, and how they can actually inhibit everything you do, particularly your future thinking. So what parallels in the movie am I talking about? I think we kind of start off with the idea that the heroine, whose name was Nancy, if you recall, she kind of knows that she has to stay awake. She knows she can't afford to go to sleep. And I think that's kind of a slightly more kind of sleep and you die. It's a bit more of a compelling version of you snooze, you lose, which you'll hear all the time. And people will tell you constantly that the need for transformation is driven by this need to continually move forward. And that's a very, it can be an easy conversation to have internally, but a hard one to actually put into execution. And the nightmares don't just occur in the bedroom. So again, if you recall, there are waking nightmares in the classroom, in the bathroom, I think even at one stage in a prison cell. And that extension of reach of the nightmare, I think actually does draw a direct comparison to the fact that with the increasing digital touch points, these dreams are going to affect all sorts of customer environments, all sorts of places that you wouldn't necessarily have originally thought about from an IT perspective. And I think it's important to think about this topic outside of a classic IT environment. And then, of course, the seniors in the movie, we've got to talk about them. They're initially sceptical of the threat. They seek traditional answers to what are problems they can't necessarily get their heads around. I think some of you in the audience will sympathise with that, possibly even recognise it. And I think, from my perspective, seeking familiar answers to new problems is very much one of the inhibitors of digital transformation. I think the idea that it can be these challenges, the new customer environments, the competitive threats you face, can be addressed through traditional, large, high-scale, long-term IT transformation programs is what we want to challenge today. We want to talk about the fact that you can get to grips with these things much earlier than that. And then here's a good one. What's quite amusing is that the parents are part of the problem, actually. I mean, they're the ones who created Freddy. I don't know if you recall the story, but they are directly to blame for Freddy's existence. Now, not controversially, that'll be a situation that a lot of you will be familiar with. The legacy systems that you've inherited, to some extent the processes, to a certain extent, the organisational structures that you all inhabit are in themselves legacies of the past success of your businesses, but actually they may well very be the inhibitors to your future success. And I think that idea that accepting that the past, however successful it might have been, may well be inhibiting is a really key part of what we want to talk to you about today. And I think establishing cause effects and breaking down silos, all of those topics are vitally important. And Ben will certainly be touching on a number of those. And then finally, only by facing down Freddy and confronting the fears that she has, and she seeks Zen master advice, only in that way is Nancy able to properly confront her fear, turn her back on it, and actually embrace the future. And I think that's a key part of what we want to talk about. But that expertise, that advice, and some of the kind of broader generic thinking around digital transformation, that in itself can bring its own fear. And I think the idea that expertise and support and a sense of inaccessibility and mistrust that can surround that area is something that's very close to our hearts. We, as a broad, consultative, but also service-based business, are aware that the answer to everything is not necessarily to bring lots and lots of people in to give you lots and lots of advice. So we are kind of going to sort of talk about the fear of the cost of engaging consultancies and agencies, the idea that these might be huge, interminable programs of change that never really see tangible results, and the fact they may not be mapped to outcomes. All of those things are vitally important, and the significant investments you're going to make, and above all, the fear of doing the wrong thing, of taking the wrong turn, of walking into this guy in the boiler room. I think that's the real concern. And at Ken & Carta, we've recognised that concern. It's what drives our mission and our passion for making expertise and support available at every stage of the journey for every client. So that's the scary stuff, and hopefully the analogies weren't too spurious for you. It can be a scary topic. That's kind of what the reason we chose the title, and I hope the reason why a number of you attended. But I think we believe that change and disruption should be embraced, and it shouldn't paralyse you in this fear. In fact, we believe that positioning and tooling yourselves to embrace and exploit them is the key to your future success. That's why Ben and myself are here on this stage today. Disruption is inevitable. It's everywhere, and it's happening at an ever faster pace. We're passionate about helping the companies and individuals that we work with. And I think that's kind of a real key point. New problem-solving philosophies and methodologies are what will address your transformation challenges. And I think that newness, that idea of embracing disruption yourselves is absolutely key. I think addressing those things head-on, equipping you to make disruption a choice is absolutely key. Yeah, it's not something that happens to our clients, it's something that they do. And I think really embracing that as a philosophy for yourselves is really key to success. But one more movie reference before I move on. A slightly less notorious movie, a film called Finding Forrester with Sean Connery in it. And it's really about him playing an intellectual heavyweight. A literary professor, a guy who lives in an apartment block that overlooks the projects in the Bronx. And he watches these kids playing basketball, and they look up and they kind of see this guy looking out the window. There's a sense of foreboding, there's even a sense of inapproachability. And I think the idea that eventually his pals bet and dare him to go and break into this apartment, and he encounters Sean Connery, and, well, I'll get you to go and watch the movie, but suffice to say, it's the beginning of an extraordinary relationship and the unlocking of incredible dreams and opportunities that otherwise, I think, the Jamal, the character in the film, otherwise wouldn't have accessed himself. And I think, I'm hoping that what we'll talk about now will give you the idea of how we inspire clients to do similar things, and Ben will talk you through particular stories. But on that note, it gives me, and no doubt you, great pleasure in introducing Ben and handing over, and he'll be your guide to telling you how we seek to inspire and help deliver for our clients.
Thank you, Graham. Clicker, please. I'm Ben Pittman. I'm Head of Engineering here at Ken & Carta, and also the champion of product value for our clients. So I make sure that all of our teams make sure that we're building the right products and building the products right for our clients. Someone's calling. It's Freddy.
It's actually you're actually calling the laptop that's down here.
Anyway, just wait for that to go.
People outside, people getting a Skyping.
Okay, so one of the things that Graham said that I really like is that we're defined and held back not only by our past failures, but our past successes. I think if there's one thing that we can learn from in businesses, the biggest kind of stark thing that I'm seeing is looking at big banks. They're trying to keep up with fintechs. They're trying to move as quickly. One thing that we're seeing that we really like is they spin up a ventures arm. And that ventures arm, rather than building on the services that the bank already has, their core ledger, building on their know your customer, building on all of their core systems, what they're doing is they're renting in systems and services from other third parties. We talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, these big banks are giants, and they are struggling to spin up new services that stand on their own shoulders. One thing we're also seeing that we don't like is the starting of innovation hubs, innovation labs, or centralized teams that are just responsible for creating reusable components that no one really wants to use, or defining services, defining service standards that no one wants to meet. What we're seeing here is something I think is the biggest lesson we can learn from horror films, is don't split up. So what I mean from that is don't split up the value chain. So what these businesses are doing, the bit that the innovation hubs do is create value right at the beginning, ideas at the beginning, and those ideas never translate, or very rarely translate, into real life. So who doesn't split up? I'm a massive fan of The Walking Dead. So it was hard to find a picture where everyone is still alive, but here we are. What can we learn from them? So they succeed when they stick together. And so what I'm going to be talking today is what we consider the most important unit in your business, and that's the squad. It's the small, self-contained, self-organizing, cross-functional team on the ground. We believe that you do need buy-in from the top. You do need to understand change from the C-suite down, but starting here and working with that squad is really how you get things done. So what do? So we like to form co-source teams. We like to join the teams with our clients. Why do we do that? Well, the first thing that I really believe is business should not outsource its core business. That's the thing that makes companies. Increasingly, companies these days do not own any assets. They do not have anything other than the intellectual property and the culture and the behaviors that business has. If they outsource it to us or outsource it to someone else, and then that evaporates, then they've got nothing. You need to keep that part of your business. So we don't want to take that away. Secondly, we believe in feeling the pain that those teams feel themselves. We don't parachute in with clipboards. We don't write reports at the end telling you how you need to transform and do everything. We feel the pain of the people on the ground, and we help the people on the ground make those changes themselves. And finally, we come in with a remit for change. We come in with a remit for transformation. The teams on the ground, the amount of times we hear, we've been saying this for so long, the business won't listen to us. Can you help us? Tell the business how to improve. Tell them the ideas that we've been having. And we will share that remit too. We'll help those teams to communicate with the business and gain their trust. That's a really important thing. How does that unit gain trust? One of the ways to do that, and I'm a firm believer in visualizing the value stream. If you can visualize how you create value for the business, and the business can understand that you're doing so, and you are focused on delivering that value, that builds a huge amount of trust for that business. So this isn't the phases of a project. These are how small units of value continue to travel through until they're in the hands of the customer, or the hands of the business represented by Rick Grimes, or the user represented by Judith there. So I'm going to focus the rest of this talk in two parts. The first of all, how do you make sure you are delivering the right product or service? And how do you make sure you're delivering the product right? Right, so we talked a little bit about that. It's not a waterfall system. We talk about Agile here. The biggest difference I see between Agile and waterfall is just how it addresses risk. with Waterfall saving up all of those risks to be found at the end. What we do with Agile is we try and make those risks, de-risk them at the beginning and de-risk them continuously as we go. In order to do that and have that autonomous team, we need to make sure that team has the prerequisites in order to do that. The prerequisites are that they have the attitude, they have the skills and the resources to make sure that happens. Now, the first part of that process was discovery. What we need to look at for discovery, and the reason why we call it discovery is because you can't just decide what your product's going to be. You do need to uncover the risks. You do need to uncover how your product is going to hit the market. And to do that, we split the risks into 3 areas. First of all, desirability. Do users want what you're trying to do, and can they use it? And then there's viability. Is this sustainable for the business? Will it make enough money to justify the costs? And finally, feasibility. Can we build it? Will it actually work? And how do we do so? Now, we talk about different roles within the business. Your business might have entirely different roles, but this is one of the ways that we often like to talk about this. Now, this isn't necessarily each of these an individual person, but we talk about the designer or the UX designer looking after the desirability for your team. Talk about the strategist looking after the viability, and the tech lead looking after the feasibility. And we also look at the product owner or the product manager really bringing everything together for that team. Now, you probably heard cross-functional teams quite a few times. Now, we also really believe in cross-functional people. We're seeing the rise of the chief technology and product officer. The ability to have the understanding of what is the right thing to build and how do you build that is incredibly powerful in the team. We talked about the biggest waste here about building the wrong thing. The next biggest waste is probably in handover. The lost knowledge, the miscommunication between different roles. If we can have that not only at the C-suite with this chief technology and product officer, but we can have that on the ground where the tech lead understands what it means to create great products, understands the skills, how to do the other roles. Maybe they don't do them. Maybe they work really closely with these people. But even understanding how these people work, the tools that these people work, is incredibly, incredibly powerful. Here's a quote from Marty Kagan. He is one of the most influential product people in the industry. And he says, "The little secret in product is that engineers are typically the best single source of innovation." Now, if you're many engineers in the room, if you're not there on the ground at the time of discovery, you're not there right at the beginning about taking those ideas through into build, then the company's missing out a big trick there. Someone once said, "We don't hire smart people and tell them what to do. We hire smart people, get them to tell us what to do." This is incredibly important. One more quote. So Instagram was launched in 2010 by Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, had only 13 employees, 9 investors in 2012, when it was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion in cash and stock. With the convergence of new platform business models, inexpensive technologies, and access to deeply specialized distributed talent, we will see the first $1 billion company of one before 2022. In fact, we'll see many. That person will be a software engineer. But they'll also be a business person. They'll also understand user experience. It's really important that when we look at teams and we look at cross-functionality, that we give that team all the autonomy that they need, all the skills they need to deliver. We bring all the dependencies within the team so they can move things out of the way and they can make things happen. Now, I would like to argue that The Goonies is a horror film. It's one of the best horror films. I absolutely love The Goonies. It was directed by Richard Donner, who directed The Omen. I don't know if people remember that. But there's one core difference in The Goonies, I think, that differentiates it from horror films. And that's that they had a mission. It was find One-Eyed Willie's treasure, save the town, stay together. So it's really important to give your team a mission. We talk at Carta about outcomes. So we talk about that, and it's quite an abstract thing. It's quite a difficult thing to get your head around. But if you tackle the outcomes rather than focusing on features, then you start thinking a bit more about risk. You start thinking a little bit more about a product, and you start to address things in a different way. For example, When I'm doing DIY at the weekend, I don't really want a 1/4-inch drill. I want a 1/4-inch hole. And if I was a vampire, I don't really want to bite people. I want to fill the void left by my immortal soul. So if I were creating a business for vampires, I would come up with, underneath that outcome, I'd come up with hypotheses. Maybe if I create a business that is around feeding vampires drawn blood, rather than providing them people to eat and kill, then maybe I can meet that need in a much better and cheaper way, and more legal. Or maybe I could do a business for vampires based on providing animal blood. Now, I'm not a vampire. I actually don't know if either of these things would satisfy the need of a vampire. Do they need people who are alive? Do they need people? Could we just give them a kitten to cuddle and that might satisfy their immortal soul? I don't know. So underneath that, I'm going to create experiments. Experiments here recognize that you do not know these things and you have to learn. One of the things that we see is the biggest killer of innovation is when people create a certainty. I remember one client was so certain that this feature would be the killer feature, and we're convinced to build it. Okay, we're going to spend tens of thousands of pounds here, and many months of development. And we built this feature, and we launched it, and nobody used it. Literally, there were almost no users who got there. If they used it once, they never came back. And eventually we went and spoke to users, and in interviews and in surveys, no one wanted that. We should have done the talking first. The way we look at that is looking at the wrong way around. You know what? I'll get to that in a minute. So underneath the mission, one of the things that we like to do to specify that mission, if you've got a consumer-facing product, one of the useful things is something called pirate metrics. That helps you. I think of each of these as questions, really. Questions that help you determine whether you're building the right thing, and the questions that help you come up with the numbers to measure whether you're building the right thing. So acquisition, how many users are you acquiring in your consumer product? And it helps you come up with the right metrics that are balanced as well, and not just vanity metrics. Activation, are they doing the things that we want them to do, or the things that are valuable to them and valuable to the business? Revenue, is it making enough money in order to be a sustainable and profitable product? Retention, are those users staying? And referral, are those users telling their friends, and are their friends signing up? All of these things help us measure at the end what we should be heading for, the direction of travel, the vision for our product. Now, if we've got that vision, and you're going back to the Goonies, One-Eyed Willie's treasure, save the town, stay together, how do we link that through to day-to-day decisions? So we look at where we are now, which is in the attic in the Goondocks there, and then we try and set ourselves within 3 months, 6 months. It's good to think about business kind of reporting cycles. We think about the next target condition. That next target condition is something we need to strive for, but something that's achievable. And the important thing is we don't need to know how to get there. That's the important thing. We set this in order to set direction. And then each of these little experiments on the way we can choose to do to understand the direction of travel and to course correct until we get there. Another team that I worked with, they set the challenge. They'd already worked out the desirability and the feasibility. We built something. Users starting to use it. The first thing that they did to understand whether the business side would be met, whether end customers wanted to buy this thing, was they had conversations and they got letters of intent. The next thing they looked for was, can we get signed purchase orders? And then do we get our first bit of revenue? And then they had a hockey stick curve all the way through to the end of February and £500,000 to track against to say, are we actually going to hit that metric for our next target condition? Now, going back to that first example as well, is how do you choose the right experiment? That other story that I gave you where the experiment that was chosen was the most expensive experiment you can choose, which is to build production software. We should be choosing the experiments that best deliver against our current level of confidence to take it to the next level. The right experiment we should have chosen there, that we couldn't convince over, was to have a conversation with users, understand if they want to use it, maybe conduct some surveys, maybe do some prototypes to build that level of confidence until we knew we were working on the right thing, until the bet we were going to take to spend tens of thousands of pounds and several months to build would be to build that production software. Right, so we're all familiar with the backlog, I think. One thing I see is often with a lot of companies, people find that innovation stops at the backlog. As soon as we have a backlog, it's just build this. It's not an experiment anymore. My argument is that it should be an experiment. And the way we like to do this is look at hypothesis-driven development. So hypothesis-driven development is just an extension to BDD. And BDD, I always have to clarify this because I think a lot of people get this wrong. So BDD is a framework for communication. It is not something for automating tests. That is a great byproduct of this. But it's to make sure the whole team is aligned on the specification of what needs to be built and the tests that we need to do at the end to make sure it is built. Hypothesis-driven development is a way of extending that to make sure we are building the right thing as an experiment in the future. So what does this look like? It's a really similar format to I want, so that. It starts with, we believe. So if you're familiar with the fly here, we believe teaching the teleporter to reproduce flesh will result in a successful teleportation. We will have confidence to proceed when I don't get turned into a homicidal insect. So we believe will result in, and then we will have confidence to proceed when. If we include this at the epic level within our backlogs, then the software developers, the testers, the entire team will understand what the experiment means. That will inform the definition of ready to include analytics and A/B testing to make sure the right things are measured, that we can get the results in at the end. One thing we often see with analytics is either business says measure everything, or the business says we'll just trust you. You just go and put things in. And then when they look at the end, it doesn't have the data in order to make business decisions. That's why we put in our analytics. It's to make business decisions off the back of the features we launch. If we don't think about what those decisions might be, we don't think about what we're actually trying to test, then we do not build features as experiments. It's so important to do this if we're going to understand what to do next. If there's one book that I recommend around product management, it's inspired by Marty Kagan. I've already quoted him once. It's an excellent book. It takes you through a lot of different models and way to think. It's really aimed at product managers. But like I said before, we talked about the CTPO. As tech people, I think we should also be reading and understanding how to do product management. Right. So we talked about building the right product. Now I want to talk about, are we building the products right? So I have engineers coming to me talking about automation all the time. They struggle to justify why they're doing this. They really struggle to talk about what we're trying to achieve here. And what I'm going to talk about now are what are the metrics that we use here. So the first metric a lot of teams measure is velocity, or throughput. Velocity being the number of story points we get through over a given time period, normally 2 weeks. Throughput just being the number of stories. I'd like to make a case for throughput here. We once plotted on a project the story points versus how long a story took, and there was almost no correlation. Now, you could argue that we just need to get better at estimation, don't we? Well, you could also argue that it's a bit of a waste of time. What we're trying to achieve here with estimation here is predictability. We want to be able to plan and understand what other business activities come in the future. If we can get the same predictability just by making sure the stories are cut in a small way and tracking that and projecting ahead, then we save a huge amount of time. I know a lot of engineers get frustrated through the extra effort and time we take to do estimates, and then being told, oh, they were wrong at the end, and you should have got better. So throughput is one way to solve that. The next thing that's useful to measure, I think, is cycle time. So cycle time is how long it takes to get from in progress to your definition of done, which is normally that feature in itself is tested. So people will say this is a Kanban measure. Absolutely. I love Scrum. I think Scrum is a really good place to start. It's very structured. If the team is forming, Scrum is excellent. The analogy I use with Scrum and Kanban is Scrum is like watering your garden with a bucket. You fill it up, you carry the bucket, and you empty it. Kanban is much more like a garden hose. Kanban is if you have the discipline, can be a lot faster and a lot more efficient. And people talk about cycle time being a measure with Kanban. It's not a measure of efficiency, though. It's a measure of responsiveness. If our throughput is how many stories or how much value is getting through the pipe, our cycle time is how long does it take to get from one end of the pipe to another? How fast are we to respond to change for our users and for the business? The next metric that I like to use here is what the number of deploys we have over a team, the team size for time. So Amazon very famously says they deploy every 11.8 seconds. So obviously they have an enormous team. But what we really want to, if we're looking at continuous deliveries, we want to be able to deploy at any time on demand. We should have our code coming through in as small increments as possible in order to get that flow. It's well studied within process management and lean to make sure that we are delivering value there and we are delivering efficiently. And the corresponding measure of responsiveness there is lean time for changes. Now, the highest performing teams in the business will take less than an hour to get their one feature from committed, all the way through into production. Now, I'm purposefully excluding release there because that can skew behaviors in a way that we don't like. If you look at continuous delivery, we talk about feature switches being a really good way of allowing us to get code into production without releasing that feature into the hands of users. One example I use is if we have a refer a friend feature. If we build the ability to create a referral ticket and send that out, we don't want to release that until we've built the ability to receive that ticket, enter that ticket, and get that referral on the other side. So if we just measure this lead time for changes from a story being done through regression, through deployment into production, we are able to optimize pretty much the whole of the build cycle there and bring that time down. If we think about high-performing teams as being responsive, being efficient, we also need to think about them being high quality. So the two quality metrics that we've got here are the change failure rate, the number of successful deployments over the failed deployments, and also the mean time to recover. How long does it take if you have a production issue? If things are down, not from when you find it until you resolve it, but when it happens until it's resolved. So we need to improve how do we spot issues sooner, and then how do we resolve them quicker as well. I get these from Accelerate. I don't know how many of you know about the State of DevOps survey. It's this book, I think, is one of the most important books in software development right now. It has defined all the metrics for high-performing teams, and then it surveys teams on their capabilities that correlate with that high performance. So they've identified 24 capabilities that correlate with high performance. We talked about a number of these here: continuous delivery, visualizing the value stream. We talked about culture. What is culture if not the behaviors that are exhibited by the teams there? I'd like to talk about just two more things here before I finish. And I'd like to talk to them around a case study. So I'd like to talk about shifting left on security and architecting for empowered teams. So about 8 years ago, Unilever came to us and said, our top execs are carrying around briefcases with sheafs of paper. They weigh a couple of kilos. They spend the first half of every meeting working out who's got the latest numbers, who's got the right numbers. And it's a security nightmare. Their assistant prints these off, and they're carried around everywhere. They could get lost. We had a very clear vision for this, clear product metrics here. They said, can we get to any performance metric in Unilever within 3 taps and 3 seconds? So that's what we built. We obviously had to make sure it was secure. These were share price sensitive information. I got sent an email saying, look at this guy, former Unilever employee. He's in jail now because he leaked Unilever's information. Don't go to jail. Do not leak our information. So the mandate for security was really high. And then, Unilever was a very slow-moving organization. They had nothing in the cloud. Everything was on-prem. So we joined their team, and we empowered that team to push from on-premise into the cloud. And it was a difficult, very difficult thing. We had to speak to their operations people. We had reams of forms to fill in. These forms, so many of the questions were not applicable to the cloud. And so even getting them to understand what we were trying to do was really, really difficult. So we moved them into Microsoft virtual machines on AWS initially, before Microsoft Azure was called Microsoft Azure. And what we did there was we pushed the dependency on hardware out of the team's concern. That was the most important thing that we looked at there. Outside of our concern, also outside as a dependency from their infrastructure and their hardware teams. We knew that this would be the single thing that would slow us down the most. And we deliver it, and we delivered it against the vision, and the business were absolutely delighted, carrying around iPads that could connect to their data, getting notifications as soon as the data was ready, being able to plan their meetings around it, being incredibly secure. But we had to keep moving on this. We had to keep moving, and when we had some platform as a service things coming out, we wanted to take advantage of that. Again, having an empowered team, wanting to move faster, not wanting to be encumbered by having to manage the operating system there. We convinced them again to move to platform as a service, this time in Azure. And they didn't understand. Again, so many boxes and so many of the security and the operations forms we had to fill in were not applicable. Around operating systems and how you're going to manage that. It's like not applicable, not applicable. You could even say that that was a really good measure of progress. The amount of questions you didn't have to answer on any forms anymore was fantastic. And then eventually we took them into serverless. So the amount of concerns that pushes down, so all you're dealing with is code. I mean, you probably all know this already, but again, this was a really difficult thing for them to understand. They were saying, well, what IP of your machine or your service? It's like, well, you don't need to worry about that. Again, empowering Unilever's teams to do this and work across and with all of their kind of centralized architects and centralized security, centralized ops people. It was a really powerful thing to see and to be able to drive with the team. Now, we cannot claim all responsibility for this. We were working with them. But one of the things that I like the most was their global security officer, James Curry-Cathy, said, by involving security collaboratively and at the start of the process, OneView became the first development project to meet all of Unilever's cloud security standards, partly because they were new standards and we helped write them. And it was for Unilever's most sensitive data. Like I said, share price sensitive. You leak this, you go to jail. He said, I'm holding up OneView as the benchmark for how security should be done for all projects at Unilever. So, and I use this within Kin and Carta all the time. This is my old benchmark for how we should do things as well. When it's at its slowest, when it's at its most difficult, to bring that dependency into the team, bring it in early, was really great. And the last story from this case study is we started working recently with another team from Unilever, a team we'd never worked with before. And that team came up to us and they said, if you're going to work with us, you have to do automated deployments. And that just made me feel really, really happy about that. Again, we can't claim all responsibility for that, but by being there at the beginning, talking about DevOps, empowering the team, trying to help them, and to have that culture come back full circle, and then come back and tell us that we needed to do it, automated deployments, that was fantastic. I was so happy about that. It's just sort of smiled, and you've got to let them have that victory as well. And it's another example of how transformation is not a discrete activity. I think it often gets thought of as a discrete activity, but it is ongoing. No, it should happen all the time, and it should also happen when we're not here. If we've started that off and we've coached and we've done our jobs well, then the teams are able to innovate. They're empowered, not because we're there empowering them all the way, but because we've set them up to succeed and continue without us. So on that note, I'm going to hand you back to Graham.
Thanks, Ben. I still find those stories inspiring, I think, in the way that we ourselves find our clients become inspired. And I think that last point that Ben made is a really interesting one, and kind of, for comedy effect only, I have lost count the number of times when I'm a dry strategist, and the number of times I'm in with a major client at the outset, or even at the ideation of a transformation program, and the inevitable question. I'm just waiting for one of the people in the room, one of the C's, to ask me when it will be finished. When will we be transformed? How will we know? Where is that gatepost? So, I mean, I think that story. In fact, those stories that Ben's just shared with you are, I hope, indicative and illustrative of our own passion and the way that we kind of try to work with clients to give them the ability to define their own destiny, but also to embrace that fear that hopefully this whole talk has dumbed away. I'm hoping that nobody's going to leave here fearing transformation. I hope, as promised, that we've kind of highlighted many of those potential alleyways and boiler rooms down which Freddy may lurk. And I think, whilst it's important to gain that Zen advice that we talked about, while it's important to gain those skills and capabilities, it's equally important that you see this as an organisational change, as a culture shift, as an embracing of the risk factor. Don't be afraid to fail. In fact, to some extent, I wish I could copyright the expression "your failure as a service," because I think it's one of the most important things we give to clients. Is the foundations, but also the confidence to try and fail and learn and deploy from there. I think it does ultimately come down to the choice you make around disruption. It is either going to happen to you or because of you. And I think if you keep that at the forefront, then disruption stops becoming this kind of slightly scary thing, and frankly a ready-made excuse for somebody else discovering or ideating around what your customers really want, and it starts to become a driver for your own development. And I think disruptors are entering every business sector. I mean, the barriers to entry are lowering, adoption exponentially accelerating. If you think about that old anecdote about how long it took 50 million users to use airlines, and the relatively 12 hours or 12 days it took for Pokemon Go, which is always a shocking example, but it's better than Pornhub. But in terms of them getting 50 million users, that story, it gives you an idea about how quickly you can be predated upon, but also how quickly you can exploit new opportunities yourselves. And I think it's more important than ever for enterprises to innovate at speed. So that story, to thrive as an organisation, be interconnected, be innovative. We've been through it ourselves as a business. We've brought together 6, 7, 8 disparate businesses under one umbrella. Those were businesses that some of whom did similar things, some of whom did very different things, and we understood that clients needed the right advice at the right time. And so that's a transformation of sorts. Not necessarily technology-driven, although technology is a key part of it. And we went through all the pain of the collaboration stories and the communication and development platforms. But it's more importantly, it's about us putting the right people in front of the right people. So I think that's really where I kind of want to leave this. I mean, that story about baddies getting together and disappearing over the hill into a happy future is a somewhat clumsy finish to this. But I think actually the story is that there are no bad guys in this story. I think we've hopefully touched on not being a prisoner to your legacy, but most importantly, I hope we've kind of made ourselves appear to be, and certainly we are, as accessible as is possible to be. In no small part of that is the fact that myself and Ben are here to continue to answer questions. If anybody wants to come and speak to us or get in contact with us later on, give us some feedback. We're always delighted to hear and to speak to anybody who would like to speak to us. On that note, I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention, and I hope you found this to be as relatively entertaining as the title suggested it would be. And I have been asked to ask you all to take your rubbish away with you, so I'd be told off if I hadn't told that. But no, great. Thanks very much, and I look forward to speaking to some of you later on, I hope.